Omar, I'm sure, needs no introduction to the community here. I'm very pleased to introduce his fifth book, Betrayal, which, if you haven't read it, I can't recommend it highly enough. Really a wonderful book. So, just to get us started, as I just mentioned, this is your fifth book. Can you tell us what was different about writing this book compared to some of the other books that you've written in your career?
So Mike, this is a bit of a departure from the other books, and since it, especially the first three books I wrote were purely crime fiction, and they were based and grounded in Karachi first of all, and this whole sort of nexus of crime and politics in Karachi, and a lot of it was based on either my experiences or the experiences of colleagues in the police and things like that. This is a departure in the sense that this is more a spy thriller, and it kind of goes into this very Cold War sort of setting where instead of the sort of Soviet-American Cold War, we have this regional Cold War between India and Pakistan, with intelligence agencies on both sides trying to play this sort of chess game on a board, trying to sort of do, get the upper hand.
Absolutely. And as a very different book, did you find that you had to do different kinds of research to prepare yourself for it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the earlier books were easier because I was writing from experience, so I was writing what you know. Of course, part of this world, because I've also worked in intelligence, is not unfamiliar to me. But yeah, in terms of it required a great more amount of research. Talking to people, sort of reading up more on stuff, on events that had happened. And especially, there's bits of the books of the book that are, for instance, based in France, in the banlieues. So, sort of just trying to understand the culture over there, the culture of that sort of culture of resistance, or whatever you want to call it, those sorts of things.
And are there any characters in Betrayal that are based on people you've worked with, maybe, and working in intelligence and so on? No names, of course.
So I'll tell you a funny story. I don't know if I should say it or not. I recently met and this one of my characters in the book is the National Security Advisor, and it was not based on this gentleman who was our National Security Advisor. Recently, and although there were some physical similarities, so I met the former National Security Advisor recently, and he said, "Thanks a lot. You got me into a lot of trouble with my wife." And I said, "I swear I didn't, I didn't base it on you." And he said, "Yeah, but tell her that." I said, "I thought this would be the best thing ever for National Security Advisors. It sort of sexes them up." But that's not how Mrs. National Security Advisor felt.
I can believe
I
that,
apologize,
yes.
and again, I'd like to go on the record and say it was not based on him, and any similarities, physical or in terms of personality, are purely coincidental.
Yeah, so if he's listening now, just
absolutely
footnote there.
Yeah.
But one of the most interesting things about Betrayal is the way that you balance a very complex spy story with quite a sophisticated and moving love story at the same time. How did you find balancing those two extremely different kinds of narrative?
So again, this was something that I hadn't had experience or a lot of experience writing before, because my previous, certainly my first three books didn't have a lot of strong female characters, and the reason for that was that the world that they kind of were looking into was a very chauvinistic sort of male-dominated world, and it wouldn't have made a lot of sense, or it would have taken away from the authenticity of that, of trying to create that world, if I'd inserted strong female characters into it. My sort of fourth book, which is about women's cricket, allowed me to do that, and then again this one allowed me to do that and allowed me to explore the love story side of it, which again was something that I had not written before. It was challenging because every time you kind of change your genre a little, adjust, it was challenging but very enjoyable.
Yeah, and a slightly unusual kind of love story with more middle-aged
Yeah.
characters
Yes,
as well,
yeah,
which we
yeah.
don't
So
see
it
as
wasn't
often.
a sort of, yeah, they weren't young people. It was sort of middle-aged love or reclaiming an old love, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So, can you tell me a little bit about how you structure your books? Because this book in particular has a very sophisticated structure in terms of the very different places around the world that the characters go to. It starts in the United States, and we go through Pakistan, France, London. How do you go about structuring your books when you're in the early stages of writing them?
I always try and a, the book or a book starts with an idea, usually a very vague idea, which I then kind of try and flesh out, almost sort of storyboarding it. And I don't have to, and I kind of create a structure around it, an almost chapter by chapter structure. I don't always follow it, but I find it's useful to construct that scaffolding so that, you know, there are times when you'll walk away from your writing and won't come back for a few months. And if you have that scaffolding there, you can always sort of go through it and say, yeah, okay, this is what I was thinking of doing. Actually, I've got a better idea now. I can, you know, get rid of this bit and put something new in. But yeah, I find that useful. Yeah.
Absolutely. And have you taken a similar approach with your next book?
I have. Again, I had to because I started writing it a while ago, and then I didn't write at all for about a year, and I've only recently gotten back to it. So having that structure in place meant that I could, you know, go back and recall, okay, this is what I was sort of thinking of doing, and yeah, you know, maybe this is a good idea, maybe I've got a better idea for this bit or whatever. So it helps in that sense.
Thank you. I think one of the lines that really stood out for me in this book is when you talk about, there's a lot about masculinity in this book and how men relate to each other. But there's a moment where one character describes another one as a truly honorable man. Could you just talk us through what honor means in the context of this book, which is all about spycraft around the world and subterfuge and all these very complicated political intrigues?
You know, so I was at this talk yesterday. I was giving a talk to some students about the world of intelligence, and the university students and all. And I told them that, you know, bluntly put, this world of intelligence or spycraft or however you want to term it, which I'm a part of, is fundamentally based on deception, right? So that's the underlying premise of it, that you are always deceiving someone in order to get the results that you want. And so if that's the premise of this world, then having someone who is considered an honorable person is sort of a contradiction in terms.
Absolutely.
Because it's a question, and again, I sometimes find I ask myself the same question, again, because I work in that world, about whether you can have honorable people in this business. And I'm not quite sure what the answer is. The jury's still out on that one. But you know, the character of the National Security Advisor is that sort of rarity in the sense that and perhaps he's a rarity because he doesn't come from that world, but you know, he comes from a slightly different world, but he's thrust into this world, and he has a different set of he has a different value system, and while that's admirable, at times, I don't think I'm giving anything away, but at times that becomes surplus to requirements as far as this world of spycraft is concerned.
Thank you, yes, and I should say as well, the ending to this book, similar to Louise's, is very shocking and definitely worth my not spoiling. So yeah, do watch out for that. But I was also wondering about your own influence, the work that you do in intelligence. How does it play into the process of writing this book and putting it together? Is this drawn from experiences you've had in some ways?
This book wasn't, but obviously what helps is that if you understand the workings of that particular world, I think you can bring that authenticity to the writing. You can sort of, I always say that my aim as a writer is to try and put people in the room.
Yes.
So that they understand, they can sort of smell the varnish on the table, or however you want to say that. And obviously that, being a part of that world and knowing how the nuts and bolts of that world work helps. It helps in crafting this narrative.
Thank you. Thinking a little bit about other inspirations behind this book, can you tell me a little about the kind of writers who influenced you when you decided to move towards spycraft as a theme?
So when I started thinking about the manuscript that ultimately became Betrayal, I had in mind a very kind of, I wanted to have a sort of a John le Carre take on our world, so sort of, obviously le Carre or Forsyth were the great sort of writers of the Cold War. And in my mind, what I was trying to recreate was that, the Cold War is finished, but we have this regional Cold War between India and Pakistan. And again, as we spoke earlier, there's this dynamic where in all the sort of great spy fiction from the 60s and 70s, you have these sorts of, drab offices and fundamentally uninteresting men and women who are engaged in this do-or-die conflict, an ideological conflict with the other side. And there's nothing particularly remarkable about these people, and yet they're fascinating because of what they do and because of the world that they live in. And that's the sort of, musty feeling that I wanted to recreate for Betrayal, but in, as I said, a subcontinental context.
It's interesting that your opening chapter is in the United States, though, I think in Virginia or DC. And we see an American intelligence operative who thinks of himself as being like a Sherlock Holmes figure, I think you say. Do you see there as being a big difference between that version of intelligence and the kind of intelligence that you portray in India, Pakistan, Iran?
Yeah, I think, especially when you talk about the Americans and the CIA and things like that, you tend to move towards a far more technologically driven understanding of intelligence. Whereas in countries like ours, it's still a lot of hard ground pounding, a lot of sort of, human intelligence, a focus on human intelligence. So there is, and when you kind of look at, or when you're gathering intelligence in those two very different ways, it tends to influence your, the way that you look at that intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a distinction that I wanted to make there.
Yes, I mean, there's this fascinating scene where it's literally just pressing a button.
Yeah.
And
yeah, exactly.
the world changes for so many people across the world.
Yeah.
So.
And you're kind of trying to make up, you mentioned his sort of Sherlock Holmesian instincts, and he's trying to make up this narrative, or he's trying to sort of investigate this thing while sitting thousands of miles away and not having any direct access. So it's all based on either drones or, remote intelligence.
Well, I think that's almost a running theme in Betrayal of bureaucrats who are a long way away from the front lines of conflict or involved in political intrigue, who are trying to see themselves as part of this game. Whereas, do you see intelligence as much more about that ground game, or do you feel that the groundwork is being forgotten somewhat?
I think it's a combination of the two. And again, if you go back to the sort of le Carre stuff from the 60s and 70s, that too is about these sort of grey-suited men who are very bureaucratic in their take on things. Because they're running a system. They're not sort of mavericks, they're running a system. And I think that's, probably that's true of most intelligence agencies, that they are large bureaucracies, incidentally involved in pretty spicy stuff.
So just one final question from me. I noticed in...
That sort of makes it sound as if they all work for KFC or something. But yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's really interesting. But I just wanted to end my questions with drawing you back to the section in London, because I'm from London. It was interesting to get that take on it. London as a setting for this intrigue that is based elsewhere. But you have a police officer named PC Ben Stokes. Is that a deliberate cricket reference?
Absolutely.
I'm very glad to hear it.
Absolutely.
Very glad to hear it. Excellent.
And it was obviously pre-Bazball, otherwise the other PC would have been PC Brendan McCullum. There you go.
Maybe in the next book.
Maybe in the next one.
Excellent. Okay, well, we've got about 10 minutes remaining, so if I would like to open it to the floor for questions. If anyone has questions for Omar, I'd be very happy to field them. So yes,
Lady in the yellow.
Yep.
I've read all your books, and one theme that seems to be very familiar, which I thought was very apt, is betrayal. But then all your books have some theme of betrayal in them. Maybe Akbar Khan or Constantine or in The Prisoner or The Party Worker with the Dawn. Every book had some kind of betrayal by the protagonist or somebody else. Was that deliberate or just happened to be it?
You know, that's a question for my therapist. But you know, it's not incorrect because again, so these worlds that these characters live in are worlds where there is a lot of deception, right? So, of course, the earlier books are about crime or policing rather than intelligence, but fundamentally, these are worlds where deception is the sort of lingua franca through which people survive. And I guess if you were to sort of make a common theme amongst the books, it's that it's the characters that become better at deception that are able to survive rather than the ones who are honorable. He's also dead, so.
Yes, please. There's the... Oh, I think we're back together.
Sorry. So with crime fiction, and especially because in Betrayal you're going towards spycraft now, there has historically been this uneasy relationship between obviously the work on the ground with regards to intelligence agencies and the way it's been fictionalized obviously in film or in literature where there's this tendency to sensationalize, right? The best example of this would be the US military-industrial complex, military entertainment complex, but also this other tendency of kind of sounding polemic, right? In terms of what's moral or what's ethical and what's not. And I just wanted to get your take on this sort of relationship or how you tend to navigate it in your work.
Okay, so this young lady was in the talk I was giving yesterday, and she didn't speak in any of those fancy words. Right? So this is all new. I don't know. I mean, rephrase that question for me. I'm struggling to sort of comprehend it.
So for instance, Spinner's State, right?
Yeah.
It is very clearly a story about terrorism and counterterrorism.
Right.
Because of the relationship that we as a country have had, even if you kind of try to separate the story and narrative and characters from the historical context, it is still operating, for me, for instance, as a reader, within that context.
Yeah, yeah.
So it inadvertently, at some point, this kind of literature does start to sound polemic, right?
Well, I think, you know, I mentioned this in the session that I was involved in the morning as well, that and that session was on violence and all in Karachi, and I was saying that the thing is that it's, for those of us who are from Karachi, for instance, we have been marked by that, and it's just natural that when we turn to various creative pursuits, whether it's painting or sort of art installation or it's writing, that history of or kind of, you know, creating that narrative history of those events creeps into that, right? So that's, and I think it's natural, and also in in the case of my books, it's something that I do. I mean, again, I say that they're fiction, but of course they're based on historical events, and they do kind of try and create almost a linear narrative of those events. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm taking too much time. But just to kind of rephrase the question.
She asked a lot of questions yesterday.
Because
Fine by me.
specifically, because you've worked with the IB, with the CTD, right? And obviously working in those organizations is very different from being a reader of a novel, or the way it's kind of presented in this very glamorized or dramatic form in a film or in any kind of literature. How, like, I was just trying to get an idea of how it is for you to kind of be straddling that line, right? You've seen the ugly side, but then there is also this tendency of kind of spinning it for entertainment purposes.
So it's interesting that you mentioned this, because I've always, and I don't know, maybe this is just a weird way that my brain works. In my professional work also, I've always related more easily, or perhaps I should put it another way, so you have a lot of data coming in, right? So intelligence or interrogation reports or whatever. And I've always tried to, and I've always found it easier to break that down into essentially a narrative story. So, you know, what is the story of, say, Osama bin Laden or Malik Ishaq or, you know, some other sort of terrorists like that. And I've always, maybe, as I said, maybe that's just, and I've also found that a lot of my colleagues also break it down. And so it's not just kind of looking at it from a data or a very removed perspective. In a way, it becomes easier, or perhaps it's easier to compute if you kind of break down that intelligence into these narrative stories, right? So, oh yeah, so that's the story of so and so, that he was born here, and, you know, kind of, and sometimes even the way that we write, for instance, interrogation reports works like that. So there's a start, you know, he started, was born here, etc., 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 and it moves in a kind of narrative arc.
I would also say that I think there's a sort of implied moral critique when you've got the difference between, as I was describing, the Americans who press a button and then the complexities on the ground where the explosions take place. I think you do touch on that in quite interesting ways.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions? Yes.
We have Slady over here.
Sorry.
First of all, thank you so much for letting us have our own crime fiction that has our local reality. And then I would like you to have some comments on genre of three novels in particular: Party Worker, The Prisoner, and The Spinner's Tale. What would be more comfortable with calling it an autofiction rather than just calling it fiction? Because words coming straight from your mouth, and for that matter, Judy Lehman's mouth, I can't consider that the author is there. So author is very much there. So won't it be a little more convincingly possible for the reader to understand if it call it autofiction, autobiographical fiction, because the elements are there?
You're the crime fiction teacher. You define what I'm supposed to be writing.
Well, you know, I think crime fiction has a long and storied history that people tend to look down on unjustly. I think it's often a way that we get an insight into cultures, as I have through Omar's books. So, yeah, I don't know how you see the genre.
Yeah. Like I said, I've never been very good at defining, you know, again, I keep saying this, that I still don't understand, and perhaps Mike and I need to have a separate chat on the various classifications or how we classify fiction. But, you know, for me, it's a story, and the fun of it is to try and tell the story. And you know, I mean, how it gets sort of boxed or where it gets boxed in is really for other people to figure out.
Thanks.
I'd like to ask a question. I was just wondering, you know, this impression, I haven't read any of your books, and, you know, we just kind of bumped in, and it's a pleasure.
That's a fresh sale right there.
Excellent.
I belong to kind of generation where we read James Joyce and stuff like that. But, you know, having said so, do you as an author write for the particular kind of readership, or do you write for yourself? I mean, do you have particular readership in your mind?
So I consider myself a fairly well-read person, and my litmus test has always been that whatever I'm writing, is it something that I, as a reader, would enjoy reading? Because I sort of consider myself the average reader, right? So someone who kind of enjoys a variety of stuff. And so if any kind of manuscript that I'm working on is able to pass that test, then I think it's, it's so that I don't necessarily. Well, it's something that kind of should be able to. It should be a compelling story. So, more than perhaps language or sort of artistry in prose, it should be a compelling story, right? So it should flow it should be something that you want to keep turning the pages over. And yeah, I think it's something that would appeal to a broad selection of people. So I don't, that doesn't mean that I'm writing for a certain type or group of people, but I think that, yeah.
It has to be philosophical, ethical. What particular genre are you doing?
Again, I wouldn't know how to write a philosophical or ethical work. Yeah, for me, it's a story. If it's a good story, people like it, that's great.
So you write for yourself, basically. The audience loves it.
I guess so.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. Do we have time for one more?
We have time for one more? Yeah?
One more. Okay, one last question in the front row here. Can we get a microphone?
Actually, just to answer this question about classification of fiction or otherwise, I just want to quote Arundhati Roy, who said that the real truth lies in fiction, in stories. So it's true. And for this lady in the front, I just want to say the book is available outside.
Absolutely, and get it signed by you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.